think we are live. Yes.
All right, then. Well, while more people join, I'll just remind that this is No-Name Podcast International, our special series to support Ukraine and bring awareness about the war. Here we talk to infosec professionals all over the world on security, cyber warfare, personal safety, and our guest today perfectly covers all of the above. We have Michal Zalewski, who also known by the name or username of Elkamtuf. Which is the right pronunciation?
I honestly don't know. I came up with the nickname and never sort of went through the thought process of figuring out how to pronounce it.
It's only meant to be written, not
Yes.
pronounced. So Michal is specializing on web, network, and software security. He's created numerous tools for security analysis, among them the AFL, American Fuzzy Lab, a guided fuzzer, which helped Michal find flaws in a lot of software. We're talking like hundreds. I think everything from GNU-TLS and GPG to encoders, Nginx server, PDF readers, and even iOS kernel. And he's also the author of several books, among them The Tangled Web on browser security, and the brand new one released in 2022. Perfect timing, by the way, the practical Doomsday on disaster preparedness, which I have right here. As far as I know, it's an evolution of your article, Disaster Planning for Regular Folks, written back in 2015. So I guess we can start. First of all, welcome. And I guess we could start with discussing this one a little bit. So was prepping something that you always been thinking about, or there was some trigger that made you switch from traditional cybersecurity to
Ruslan, you have it.
personal?
Did you read it?
Most of it.
Oh, cool. Because I bought it, but I never read it. The actual Doomsday came, so I had no time.
Yeah. Nice.
Well, I actually read the most interesting part, which is not the tools you need to prepare and everything, but I think 2/3 of the book actually talks more about like mindset and what to prepare for in terms of logistics. I don't know. Economics takes a big part of it. Yeah. So I guess the question is was this always your thing, being prepared, or was there some trigger that got you into this?
So first of all, thank you for having me. Let me kind of flip this question on its head, right? I think it always bugged me that when it comes to computers, few people would disagree that you should have backups of important data, and that you should probably be running some sort of antivirus software or whatever, right? Like you should be taking reasonable precautions to have some sort of protection and have some sort of a backup plan if things go wrong, right? But when we talk about physical work, and we built our entire careers around giving that advice, right, to companies, to individuals. But when you start talking about the physical world, our approach suddenly changes completely, right? And we start looking a bit funny at anyone who says they have fire extinguishers around the home, or let alone having food or water in case of an outage, right? And you kind of start suspecting that maybe there's something wrong with this guy, maybe they are crazy, maybe they are an extremist of some sort, right? And it just never made any sense to me. Earlier in my life, I went through some interesting periods, as many of you, right? I grew up in Poland back in the Soviet days, and as Poland was the USSR, but it was effectively under their control, right? And then later in the teenage years, I got to experience this painful transformation into a free market economy, and we had hyperinflation and political turmoil and all that. Then I was getting at the beginning of my career, I lived through the dot-com crash, and then a bit later the housing crisis. So I think there's like this. I had this moment where I just realized, look, a lot of those problems are very similar to what we are dealing with in the infosec space, and you can use the same tools to analyze and reason about the risk and sort of come up with backup plans. And that's kind of why I ended up writing the book in the first place, not to try to convince people that the apocalypse is coming and you need to repent for your sins, but just to say, hey, stuff happens, and it probably happens more often than we normally sort of intuitively suspect. So here are some tips on how to build a simple and rational backup plan. So that's kind of the story.
Right. So I guess your mindset was just there from the beginning, right? There was no, because many people, I think, they only start thinking about it when something bad happens, actually, both in computer security and regular security, right? Because you said, I think the notion that everyone should have backups and, kind of plans for disaster recovery and whatnot, it's a little bit of our kind of professional bias. A lot of people in the industry don't actually, well, I mean, in theory they do, but they don't spend much time on it until something bad happens. And then they kind of try to do through backup procedures, that verifying that the recovery actually works and all that stuff. So I guess you just had the right mindset from the beginning. It sounds like.
Maybe, but I wouldn't necessarily say so. I think a lot of it was just living through the experiences that I had earlier in life, and when I was kind of, for example, that episode of hyperinflation in Poland, right? Like that was my teenage years, and I didn't know any better. That was just our reality. You didn't think about it very much. But then many years later, when I was explaining it to my kids and telling them about my upbringing and my childhood, I sort of started asking myself, hey, so how often does that actually happen around the world, right?
And about every 10 years, yeah.
About every 10 years. I think hyperinflation is actually, it's insane, right? Like there were like 50 episodes of it or so in the past, 100 years.
Yeah.
And so it's actually surprisingly common, but we don't talk about it, right? Like it's always something that happens somewhere else, and like, some impoverished country far away, and war never happens to us. Hyperinflation, recessions never happen to us until they do, right? And so I think that was one of the, but yeah, I think it's a realization I had at some point in my life, but I don't think I was born this way, right? Maybe a bit predisposed, and that's how I ended up.
I was gonna say, yeah, living in the Soviet Union kind of sets your mindset straight in this regard, compared to living in the United States, which didn't have war on the soil for like, I don't know, probably since the Civil War, or if we don't count Pearl Harbor, and just generally things are much more stable, I would say. So it's easy to get kind of relaxed and not focused.
But the funny thing is that in Europe, where you had like pretty much constant conflict and conquest, and you have like this very, very recent development of relative peace, and even that is gone out the window right now, effectively. But it's in Europe where people look at preppers and all that with like a lot of suspicion, right? I think in the US it's still a bit wacky, but it's a large subculture, right? That people, like, there are businesses catering to them. There are like large communities, and yeah, it is fringe. It is not mainstream, but it's out there. And in Europe, I think there's a lot more suspicion, and it's a lot less common for people to prepare, even though hundreds of years of like constant conflict and war, compared to the US, where not all that much happened over the past 200 years or so.
I think it's also the more individualistic nature in the United States that kind of you need to rely on yourself, that helps that a little bit. You also mentioned everything that the Poland has gone through in the past 30-40 years. As someone who just got back from it, I want to tell that Poland has gone, I think, through amazing transformation and did a lot, because right now it's a really, really nice country. I've only been to Krakow, but I definitely want to visit more cities now. And hopefully it does, prospers further and does great things. So it's a good example of how to recover from all the bad things that came with the Soviet Union and just generally the dictatorship. Would you say it was harder to write the Tangled Web versus Practical Doomsday? Because those are two very different books.
Yeah, I think both of them were, challenging in their own ways. The Tangled Web is a classic computer security book, right? But it involved quite a bit of painstaking research to actually document many of the previously undocumented security properties of the web ecosystem. So it wasn't just, me rehashing the same old talking points, right? Like I probably spent about as much time doing like actual testing and research as I did writing. Practical Doomsday is very different because it's not a technical reference book, right? So at its core, you have this impassioned argument I'm trying to make, trying to convince readers, most of whom are going to be skeptical, right, to think about risk and risk management in a new way. And I'm very proud of the outcome, and I think it's a funny thing to say that it stood the test of time, because it's a book written a year ago, but I think like a lot of interesting things happened since. But yeah, it was definitely a challenge to put that together for very different reasons, right? Like, you really need to make the story compelling, which you don't necessarily need to do in a book on computer security.
And I think the surface of things you need to think about is way larger than the deep technical analysis of things, versus like everything from falling off the chair to, I don't know, aliens invasion.
Yeah,
which
I think
he does
the
talk
other
about,
thing,
by the way.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's weird is how politicized it all is right now, right? Like, you can't really talk about, I don't know, climate change or extreme weather or COVID or self-defense or whatever without sort of walking into this minefield of very, very strongly held beliefs. And it was actually really difficult to write in a way where I don't lose half of the readers because they just like throw out the book angered by the political statements that I'm making, right? So sidestepping that was a challenge of its own.
Got it. Sorry, I was just thinking about our questions that we should cover next, not next, but later. So I'll make a note about it. But anyway, we'll come back to this because, like you said, definitely there is polarization, and I think I know where at least part of it comes from. But we'll get back to this in our next section. For now, after February 24th, after Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine, we also look at life a little bit different, and definitely evaluate risk very differently. So in regard to that, what would you highlight? Would you highlight like any specific advice from the book that became more relevant? Or would you want to add something to the book maybe after this happened?
Michal, before you start answering that question, could I please rename you in the stream from Michal Z to just Michal? Because there is some rumbling going on in the chat room.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
If
yeah,
you don't mind. Yeah, I just did it.
There we go. Sorry about that, I guess.
No, you have a pretty good reason to have that shortened to Z, but yeah, it's a trigger. It's a trigger for a lot of us.
Normal people don't think about it. That's fine. That's how it's supposed to be.
Cool. Yeah. So,
what was the question? Sorry for interrupting that.
I think the question was about sort of the changes in my perspective or content in the book after the invasion. And I think it's just an incredibly difficult topic, because ultimately war is one of the most difficult scenarios to prepare for, right? Like, it's not as simple as telling someone to buy a particular product or change their habits in a particular way. It's like this long-lasting and mass-scale disaster about the worst that you may have to deal with. So yeah, I'm sort of very nervous providing some sort of like concise prescription for how to deal with war on your soil. From the the one thing I'm going to say, and I do make that point in the book, that from the perspective of self-preservation, obviously the best thing to do is to get out, and to get out as early as possible. But of course, there's this conflicting interest in protecting your home country and not letting the aggressor get away with their plans. And if everybody leaves, then so there's really no scientific way to reconcile that. It's sort of this moral question that every person needs to ask themselves and needs to make some very personal decisions. But there is one thing that comes to mind, watching the run up to the invasion and many other disasters, from floods to wildfires to many others. And I do talk about it in the book, and it's the parable of the boiling frog, right? When every day is only a tiny bit worse than the day before, it's very difficult for us to draw the line at some point and make life-changing decisions, such as packing your stuff and going somewhere else, or gearing up for combat, right? And that's how people end up on the roofs of submerged homes and perish in wildfires and so on and so on. And in Ukraine specifically, I think, we had like the US intelligence community giving remarkably precise and confident warnings, and really unprecedented ones, right? That the invasion is like, the decision has already been made, it's coming soon. And they are sometimes wrong. The US intelligence community is not sort of, infallible, but they are seldom wrong about Europe, because I think they have very good access and sort of, they are very sort of, culturally connected. And I think they have a much better understanding of politics in that region than in many others. We also had a massive buildup of Russian troops on the border, right? And we had Putin giving dark speeches about rebuilding the USSR. So objectively, it was not business as usual. But a lot of people ignored it, right? Because they were basically hoping for the best. Even the government of Ukraine was dismissing the worries, right? And like sort of, calling out the US for sort of fear mongering. And it's a very, very human thing to do. And I'm not trying to say that like anybody did anything wrong, but it's also a terrible way to manage risk. And so, the one thing I advocate in the book is defining clear criteria that let you decide, hey, this is no longer normal. I need to do something drastic, right? Like, again, I need to either get out or find a way to get a gun. And doing this before you're in a stressful and ambiguous situation like this, right? So almost doing like in our industry, we do that in detection and response when we write checklists and plans and criteria for, kicking off initial incident response before it actually happens, because this is when we can think clearly, right? And we're not going to be able to think as clearly when everything is on fire. So that is, I think, one of the more important lessons of the book, and something that it is just human nature to mess it up, I think, because that's just how we are wired.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because definitely I think everyone in Ukraine is aware of this phenomenon where, especially older people, it's like impossible to get them to move. Like they would literally be living in Kharkiv, in Mykolaiv, under constant shelling every single day, and they wouldn't leave even not even the country, just the city, and move a little bit, closer to the west, where at least there is no like daily shelling. And it's hard to understand why, especially considering that those people, like older generation people, are the ones who actually lived through like Soviet Union, who were closer to Second World War, and also some military conflicts following the Second World War, and yet they are maybe because they used to it. I don't know. It's a phenomenon.
I think as long as you're making a conscious decision that you don't want to run, you want to stay, and whatever happens. I think that's fine. It's worse when you're lying to yourself, right? Like when you're telling yourself this is probably fine, like that meme with a this is fine dog, right? And I think that is the peril to avoid, right? Like again, if you're making a conscious decision that you're just tired of running away, that like you want to be there and you want to face the oppressor if they come. Again, that's a perfectly rational, moral decision to make. But I think it's the actual hazard is people who, when the invasion actually began, a lot of people realized that they do want to get out, and it was too late for many of them at that point, right? And either the journey ended up being a lot more difficult and dangerous than it needed to be, or they just couldn't get out at all, right? Like they were turned around at the border. I think
I don't think people are making conscious decisions about risk, like except for the portion that is trained professionally to do so.
Yeah.
And this unwillingness to move, I think it's culturally conditioned. It's history. It's not training at all. It's not thinking. It's this population was displaced during last 100 years several times. So their psychological unacceptability of a possibility to move once again It's not something that would come easily. Younger folks, yeah, they didn't have those experience, they didn't have those stories told by those who survived. You know, it's like, why don't Eastern Europeans, I don't know, in general, maybe not, but the folks in Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, why don't they express their emotions as freely as people in Western Europe or in the US? You know, it's just genetics, I think, or again cultural constraints, because people who expressed empathy and emotions to those who were detained and then executed or sent to gulags were also detained, executed, and sent to gulags. And in the end, the only those who did not express much emotion or trained themselves and their children to not express the emotion.
I think that's more of a conditional training, sounds like.
Yeah, towards the enemies of the state and enemies of the people, survived. You know, and then it was passed on from generation to generation, and even if there is no more terror, but the memory of terror is
I think that's definitely true, right? And you can see that, like, I hate to generalize, but I think, you see that in Poland as well, right? And it actually causes some interesting friction because, there's like a particular way of being that people from Poland and a way of communicating that people from Poland adopt. And it's like, like heavy reliance on sort of, jokes and sarcasm and all that actually sort of rubs many people in the West the wrong way, because, they are just not in Poland for a long time. Like, that this underhanded humor was a way of expressing your beliefs without getting in trouble, and I think a lot of people adopted this as a and I think you can also see that in China, right, where you had like people imagine that like countries like China are like like totalitarian dystopias where people really want to speak their mind but can't because there's like a police officer like listening to you at any given time. And I think the reality of non-free countries like that is a lot more mundane, which is that there was a generation that grew up with some terrifying like with terror, right? Like with millions or tens of millions of people being killed. Same in Russia. And the next generation grew up like was basically taught, don't say certain things, don't think certain thoughts because you're gonna get in trouble. And now the government of China doesn't actually, like, people self-police, right? And I think that again, like true in a lot of the former Soviet republics where you had to unlearn this. It's probably still true in Russia to a significant extent.
It is. And Applebaum
I think much worse,
writes
actually,
about it a lot because the main confusion about like the end of totalitarianism in Russia in the 90s, it just happened to be an illusion because it never happened, right? So the totalitarianism did not end. And the main perception of it going along with terror is appeared to be false. Yeah, because terror is required only in the beginning, and then only the memory of terror is what's required in order to keep everyone within the boundaries for the generations.
Like the monkey experiment.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and I think people like it's anyway. I don't want to take us on a complete aside. So,
well, it's interesting anyway. So let's maybe get back to the agenda.
Yeah. I was also thinking that back to the threat of the war, we're kind of less evolutionally conditioned to think about that type of threat, global threat, on the scale of countries. Because when you're walking in a dark alley, you're in the moment, you're kind of thinking about all the worst situations or scenarios that could go with you. But when you're just sitting in your apartment and there is a threat, like US official talking about threat of Russia starting war, it's not triggering the same sensory response. So that's why people maybe a little bit less sensitive to that kind of
however, Pelosi's plane is the most followed on Flight Radar at the moment. people are concerned, and
that's when you do like cognitive analysis, I think, and less people, I don't know, I feel like less people try to put effort into that. But anyway, so with this war starting, was there anything that kind of changed in your personal preparedness strategy? We had, threats of nuclear attack and whatnot from Putin. Does that change anything in your kind of day-to-day strategy?
No, I don't think it did. It probably would if I were in Poland, for example, because I think the sort of the geopolitics in Europe have changed in a significant way, and I think some of the there's a very real risk of escalation, not necessarily nuclear, although I don't think this is something to entirely dismiss, because I think one of the significant concerns is that Russia has a significant stockpile of so-called tactical nukes, right, which are not meant for destroying countries and ending wars. They are meant to give you tactical advantage, right, and sort of blow up like a portion of the city, right, and at some point they may have a temptation to use that if I sincerely hope not, but it wouldn't be necessarily such a clear-cut escalation as we imagine. And I think it would be difficult for the world to respond, and they may sort of decide that they can actually try that and get away with it, just as they did with the invasion of Ukraine, right, on some level, and many other invasions before and interventions. But yeah, I think in the U.S. I think nothing fundamentally changes. I think the nuclear risk is something that shouldn't be on the top, near the top of your list of concerns. I think there are far more mundane considerations like unemployment, injury, recessions, and so on that we should be thinking about, or week-long power outages. But like the stockpiles of nuclear weapons are pretty massive. There's a lot of nuclear reactors around the world, and intentional action aside, mistakes happen, right? And again, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to build a bunker and plan for the post-apocalyptic fallout like future, but there are some common sense things you can do to improve the odds in the event that something happens some distance away, but still has effect on your immediate surroundings for a while, or just causes socio-economic disruption for a while.
And we do have examples of that happening in the Soviet past, where fortunately there was enough kind of fail-safe mechanisms and personal decisions to prevent the strike, but they only had the situation where like all the warnings triggered and they were pretty much ready to fire. So.
Yeah. I think there may be a separate question here about the sort of the cyber realm, right? Which I think a lot of people were kind of expecting that future wars will be fought mostly in the digital realm, and I think they must be quite disappointed with reality. And obviously the internet is an important part of military strategy today, but in rather mundane and familiar ways, right? It's not like hackers fighting hackers necessarily, and yeah, I think from that perspective, the landscape hasn't changed a whole lot as a consequence of the invasion. But I think there is a more gradual shift happening in the background. I think after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, there was this popular belief that we reached the end of history, right? That the world now accepted the Western values and large-scale conflict is impossible. And it's increasingly clear that the world is not as simple as that. And sometimes nations use the internet to achieve strategic objectives because it's just such a convenient and deniable tool, and you don't actually have to send agents overseas where they sort of risk being arrested, uncovered, whatever. And so that sometimes happens in really surprising ways. A good example of this is North Korea using ransomware operations and cryptocurrency heists to circumvent sanctions. And in this world, as a random private citizen can become a victim of North Korea. And so yeah, I think the world of computer security is changing, and Russia also has this like symbiotic relationship between cybercrime and this state apparatus, right? So so yeah, I think the world of computer security is changing, and we should be adopting. There's like this whole new class of adversaries in town that you previously did not have to worry about. Again, I don't think there's a qualitative difference just because of the invasion in Ukraine, but every year makes this a more acute and pressing problem for all of us.
Yeah, you pretty much moved into the next question, and
sorry.
No worries. That's actually perfect. And just before we do that, I was gonna say that
Ruslan, one thing to wrap up maybe this topic is actually about this risk calculation. Right, so like one thing that was kind of a little bit eye-opening for me is that, and I still think that it's kind of like mistake, right, when we do this risk analysis. It's like we consider like Russia in this case, right, as a rational agent, and again, like they should be afraid because they want to take away with it, right, like they do some like very big war crime or something. But honestly, all the incidents that we see, like they suggest that they just don't behave rationally right now. And like all these barbaric scenes, like and everything that's happening, like all the war crimes. So do you think like we should take this into account and like change like this risk model and threat model and indeed like like high the bar right in our preparedness?
I think
excuse me, before we dig into it, I would first politely disagree with Alex that they do it irrationally. They do it rationally. They do it unreasonably, but they rationalize it perfectly. They just have garbage.
Yeah, let me rephrase. Rationally, but not in these like Western values, right? So I think there's like completely misunderstanding of what is their rationality.
They rationalize what they want to achieve, right? And in order to do that, they have some strategy, however bad it is, and they have some input data, some intelligence, some operational awareness, all that kind of stuff, and it sucks. It's shitty. Garbage in, garbage out, right? And they still achieve their strategic goals because their strategy is not quite sophisticated. They experience huge losses along the way, but they should be judged and measured by the objective they have, not our expectations about them, but the objectives they make for themselves. If they meet their objectives, they are successful. If they are not that sophisticated, clever, or whatever, it doesn't bother them, and it shouldn't bother us. That's what I wanted to underline here, because we shouldn't underestimate them. Right, so every time we underestimate them tactically, we introduce a flaw in our thinking, right? So they strive for something, and it's not really sophisticated or cool, and they achieve it.
I think people do succumb to this like simplistic thinking about what adversaries are going to try to achieve, and there's like we kind of default to movie plots sometimes, right? Like we think that it's going to play out like in an action movie, and quite often it doesn't, right? Again, the goals can be much simpler, but I think what's useful to ground us is to really look at history, right, of how those actors operated in the past, how military conflicts unfolded, and I can give you a very good example of and maybe I'm sort of getting ahead of another of your questions down the line, but the Russian influence operations are a perfect example, right? And a lot of people are kind of befuddled by them. Why are they targeting this sort of set of topics? Why are they like in the US? Why are they sort of trying to at the same time elevate like random pro-Trump secessionists and some like fringe radical left or sort of communist parties, right? Like what are they trying to do? What's the goal? It seems like chaos, right? And but I think when you look at it from the historical point of view, like Russian influence operations are nothing new, right? They are basically the same playbook as they used back in the Soviet era, and it's Interesting that, in the US, there's this now dominant belief among intellectuals about the paranoia back in the days of the Cold War, right? Like how the Red Scare, when the FBI was looking for communist influence in the academia, in the media, in Hollywood, and everywhere else, how all of that was just like one big delusion, right? Like there were no communists in the US, or no communist infiltrators. And of course, some of that, witch hunting went too far. But just this month, we learned about Russian agents indicted for bankrolling radical political movements in Florida and California, like two completely opposite political movements. Like again, radical left and radical right. And it is precisely the same playbook as in the 60s and 70s. And the goal is to not to necessarily get your opponent to see things your way, but it's to sort of sow discord and discontent and exhaust people to the point where nothing gets done, and certainly the country is too divided and too preoccupied with infighting to actually intervene on the international scene. And so the thing is, it works, right? Like back then, it paid off. Like a lot of the anti-Vietnam War or anti-nuclear proliferation movements in the US had ties to Russia, and they, like the cause may have been sort of morally righteous, but like they prevailed, and they did not prevail organically. They prevailed in large part because they had sort of that logistical and financial support. And I think we're seeing the same thing today, and really, if you study history, even very superficially, I think you see a lot of parallels, and nothing here is a mystery or a secret, right? It's just not what we would expect based on Hollywood films necessarily.
History is a good thing, but you see, like just strategically, I think the US and Russia, they think very similarly. They expect something similar to happen, to something that already happened before. They assess the situation in terms of did something similar happen before? Okay, it did. What did we do back then? We did this thing. Did it work? Yes. Okay, let's redo it. If it didn't work, let's do something else. Let's do the opposite. Like for instance, with the Ukraine, right? In early 2022, yeah. It was already obvious for everyone that it's not gonna be Poland in late 80s, right? So this build up and the pre-invasion conditioning of the global political spectrum, yes, it was just in the end, it happened to be just a threat. It never actualized. But in Ukraine, they went further, right? And everything that NATO and the US did in this regard before the invasion was basically what they did during the Poland crisis, right? So it didn't work out because they see Putin. Who is Putin? Is Putin Hitler? Not yet. Okay. Then who is it? He's Gaddafi. Okay, we will do what we did to Gaddafi. Oh, Putin did next step. Now he's Hitler. Okay, let's do what we did to Hitler, including the strengthening the Eastern Front and Lend-Lease, literally, right?
Yeah.
Producing more weapons and stuff in Ukraine with it. So yeah, so the situation changed and they changed their perspective. Their strategical thinking was not very sophisticated at all, at least from the hindsight and just observing it all in action, right? I make this opinion, but I may be mistaken, but it's very similar. Same thing from their side, right? Russians. Yeah. What is Ukraine? Czech Republic. All right, let's do what we did in Czech Republic. It's just a breakaway nation that it's not hard to bring it back, to the cradle of Russian world, and we will do it easily. Wait, something went wrong. we miscalculated something. Obviously, we had some bad data, but now we will do what? We will do, I don't know, Afghanistan. So it's pretty simple in their heads. I don't think they're like strategic geniuses. They think by analogies. And these historical lessons, these analogies, they can backfire. Because just learning history and thinking by analogy obviously can weaken our positions, as we unfortunately see.
Yeah, I think, it's very common for people to kind of assume that because something happened in a particular way before, it's going to happen the same. So, when people, this is people looking for indications of recessions as well. They look, in the past 5 recessions, this thing happened right before. So now, when we see that signal, it's a sure sign that there's going to be a recession. And, they turn out to be completely wrong, right? Because, you're seeing a pattern, but it doesn't mean that that pattern is sort of, always going to be there. But I think there is, more strategic thinking than maybe meets the eye. I think, when you look at how Russia played Europe for the past, several decades, where they sort of, increased their dependency on gas and so on, I think NATO may be not as simplistic as we describe it. It's just that their hands are tied by the dependence of their members, like, Germany, for example, right, on Russia, which was actually, it was actually kind of amazing to watch, right? And I think, Poland for a long time really pushed back on that and was sort of, stigmatized for it, right, by other EU members.
I still think it was bad intent. I don't think they were acting in good faith. I don't know. It's my opinion. I do not represent anyone, but unfortunately, I think that they did it on purpose, because getting rid of our best chance at energy crisis resolution, and just buying more gas from Russia. I don't know who could do it. Who in their clear mind could do it. It's a decision so unlogical to me.
Sorry that I took us to this political road.
Yeah.
I guess let's come back to cyber.
But it's still close.
Well,
it's about nuclear power plants. Non-existing in Germany.
It's again, it might be rational for you, but to them the world may look a little bit different. Anyway, so spoiler alert, you got exactly into some of the next questions, and that's perfect. I guess only one thing I wanted to add, that regarding the cyber war, right? It's not necessarily that it doesn't happen. It's more that it's harder to see it in a way, right? If I don't know if you'll see, but there is a there is kind of visualization of cyber attacks. Was that?
There is some activity, definitely.
Yeah, there is some activity, and this is basically a plot of all detected attacks in various countries, basically Ukraine, Russia, and the rest of the world. You can clearly see the beginning of the war. We just don't hear the explosions. So, I mean, while of course it's not what the Hollywood would paint us, with like Russian hackers sitting in hoods, with gloves on and like hacking away, but still there is a lot of action going on. Going back to cyber war, which a lot of it we already discussed, one thing that we wanted to cover was like the way they influence foreign countries, right? So you already mentioned this revelation by Department of Justice, where FSB official was trying to kind of instigate protests, even finance like a governmental takeover building in California, which fortunately didn't happen, but we know there is a takeover of, or at least an attempt of governmental building takeover that did happen after the election. And just for me, for the longest time, I didn't believe in the effectiveness of these like online bot forums, right? Which is the primary tool that they use for influence opinions. Because to me, it was just crazy to think that, you would build, you would base your decision of who to vote for or what policy to take or how to act based on some anonymous guy on Twitter yelling something. To me, it was still, you would rely on some kind of comprehensive analysis from trusted sources. You would talk to people you at least personally know, their background, where they come from. So it's not just like random person on the internet, right? And yet somehow in mass, that kind of seems to work pretty well. So was there like, do you kind of understand this phenomenon, why this works? And do you think there are any lessons learned from Russian information warfare, like in their attempts to influence public opinion?
Well, so, let me preface this by saying that, I work for a social media company, and I'm not here to speak on their behalf. So to avoid impropriety, I think,
right. I mean, like any online influence in general.
No,
right?
but I
actually
do have an answer. I just wanted to preface with that, right? So I'm gonna maybe sidestep this, bot part of this, but I can comment more broadly on propaganda as this like enduring societal phenomenon, almost independent of what's happening online. And from that perspective, I think, the mistake we often make is this tendency to classify the ecosystem of news in terms of binary choices, like, real or fake, and, we're going to combat fake news, and that's going to solve the problem, right? But many of the most effective misinformation campaigns actually exist somewhere in between, right? It can be real information just editorialized in a particular way, or maybe amplified in a way that bombards you with fringe news that makes you believe that a particular problem is, more pronounced than it is, or, maybe like Ukrainian soldiers are as bad as Russian soldiers or whatever, right? And you don't necessarily do that, again, by manufacturing information. It's just, promoting particular incidents, worldviews in a particular way. And again, especially for Russia, the goal is often not to convince you to see things their way. It's to create false equivalencies or fan the flames of conflict. And so they actually don't, they don't care about quality, right? They care about like catering to small groups of people and getting them to fight with each other. And so, the problem is that, many of the solutions we see to problems like that, when we think about it in binary terms, is that we just need an arbiter of truth, someone who's going to, a trusted source who's going to tell us what's right and what isn't, right? Fact checkers, old school journalists. And I think when you actually designate a person to do that, they often find themselves in this impossible position where they are litigating some super finer points of the stories that are, again, like mostly true, but maybe just editorialized in a particular way, promoted in a particular way. And ultimately that undermines their own credibility, because you are really dissecting this fine point here. Like, what are you trying to do, right? Like, you're not going to change any minds, right? It feels like you're really stretching yourself thin. And I think, and that's precisely why it works, right? Like it's it's what people want to read. It's mostly true, and it's very difficult to combat. And I think the solution here may be to make sure that people are, instead of trying to reactively combat it, it's make sure that people are proactively exposed to balanced, rational takes on key events, so that they have a reasonable toolkit for evaluating new claims. But the difficulty there is that, we are in a world where we are increasingly consume news tailored to our views, right? So I think we like the filter bubbles and whatever. And in that world, I think, it's just difficult to accomplish that goal. And the other thing that I think is sort of messed up in how we approach that is that we think about a lot of this as technological problems, right? But if you have a mainstream politician parroting Russian propaganda, that's not a problem you're going to solve with technology, right? It's and that is very much happening in Europe. That is happening in the US. So yeah, I don't have a simple prescription here, but yeah.
Obviously, if it was simple, we would already be doing this. But basically, also the reason I was interested to hear your opinion, because as I was thinking about it, is also the kind of the ideas that I had in mind is that people talk a lot about like online bots and propaganda through the internet right now, and to me it seems by just briefly studying the history of Soviet Union and like Russian propaganda throughout the years, they have always been doing it with precisely the methods that you described, and have been doing it fairly successfully to a certain degree. And unlike many people say, internet is not something that essentially enabled this from scratch. It just made it simpler. It's just easier to reach people, easier and faster to see feedback, easier and faster to correct. Yeah, it's just a scale and simplicity that kind of made it. But essentially, all of the methods remained kind of the same. It's just easier to deliver across the ocean.
And the one thing that you described the problem and possible solutions and their flaws and incompleteness very thoroughly, and it made me think that maybe just the solution is more simple than we imagine. That the people who clearly understand the big picture and can fact check and can verify everything and do background checks about the people who spread the messages and all that kind of stuff could join together and then cater these high quality news products to broader audiences. And then I thought, oh, basically that's what they do.
That would be a beautiful reality. Yes.
That's what they do,
Yeah.
I think there are two ways to go about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think sorry, go ahead.
No, please go.
No, I was going to say that even in the world of sort of establishment press, I think like ultimately nothing everything gets written for a reason, right? And it's not like a lot of what's written is because people want to sort of convince others, get them on board with their views, sort of align them with their beliefs, yeah. And so even in that space, you don't have. Like again, there are journalists who are repeating Russia's talking points sincerely and with belief, right? And that includes journalists respected in our industry. Like there's a lot of people who have deep respect for Glenn Greenwald, for example, or used to, right? Going back to to his sort of tech journalism. But like. And I have no reason to believe that he, like, I think he is being sincere in his beliefs, right? But I think he repeats a lot of the sort of anti-Ukraine propaganda as well.
Snyder, Timothy Snyder, yeah, the writer. He explains it by the framework of 3 N's. They make people complacent by exploiting 3. That's a mnemonic for NATO, nukes, and Nazis. So right. Wherever you go, you will see people who have complexes, like deep down complexes of thinking that NATO is bad. Yes, yeah. American and European imperialism is bad, and NATO is bad. And yeah, it's easy to convince them that NATO was, if not the cause, but the trigger or lubricant or catalyst or whatever for the conflict. Yeah. Most people are afraid of nukes, so yes, nukes work as well. And many people have complexes about Nazis, Germans, for instance, or Austrians, or Hungarians, or I don't know, Spanish, half a euro basically. Yeah, so they have this built into their mentality because basically it's a good thing that they have these complexes. It keeps many people safe for almost 100 years. But still, right? It's easy to manipulate them because they think it's horrible, and the slightest clues of this existing in Ukrainian political life, which is basically almost non-existing even compared to the US. Yeah. It makes it easy to make them complacent. And you cannot make a group of people who are always right and make them like project their vision and their values to the rest of the population, because everyone is different and everyone has these differences in their values.
Yeah, I think that's right, and especially that sort of anti-NATO sentiments are, that's a wonderful fertile ground, right? Like on the far left, you have a lot of people who hated NATO before because like it's this instrument of imperialism, right? Like you know, you can't really point to any territory annexed by NATO forcibly, but like, you know, in principle it functions as this, you know, evil tool of the empire.
Evil for the ones who oppose it.
Yeah, so it's so easy for Russians to tap into that, and like, you know, like, yes, if you are predisposed to that, if you have that mindset, you're gonna, like, you know, those talking points are gonna be appealing to you. And on the far right, you have the same problem, like, you know, the NATO or any sort of, you know, international institution is, you know, the tool of the globalists, right? To sort of, you know, take away your guns. And so I think it's actually quite masterful, right? And it really underscores why this is a difficult problem to solve.
But again, getting back to the technology side of it, did you see this correlation between there was a study, not a study, but a survey, I guess, in Austria recently, and there was this screenshot of correlation between who people blame for the war that Russia brought to Ukraine, right? And whether they are vaccinated.
Yeah.
And the majority of unvaccinated people think that it's NATO, US, Europe, whoever, maybe even Ukraine, but not Russia. And vaccinated people think that it's mostly Russia, right?
But,
and one explanation could be that there is some correlation in, I don't know, general awareness of how the things work, but if you dig deeper, you see that there's just the same bot farms that produced anti-vax propaganda before completely changed their goals.
Yeah, and the thing is, you know,
at these objectives, you know,
Russia doesn't give a shit about how many people in the West are vaccinated. They just want to stir, like, yeah, they want to get people riled up and cause conflicts, right? And yeah, I think, you know, it is a problem, right? Because, you know, there's a lot of people who think about themselves as independent thinkers, and so they seek out, you know, information out of the mainstream, and it's very easy to get sucked into a rabbit hole like that. And we see that in our industry. Like, you know, how many friends do we have who are sort of, you know, spew conspiracy theories about, you know, evil corporations or whatever, and, you know, how Facebook or whoever is conspiring to and look, I have no love for Facebook or Exxon or Monsanto, whatever, but like you actually see so many parallels between that and, you know, and people who back in the day used to, you know, talk about UFO conspiracies and all that, and who now talk about anti-COVID, you know, whatever, like, and I'm not even talking about plausible, you know, theories, but like, you know, about how COVID is a hoax and vaccination, it has, like, you know, nanobots. The vaccine has nanobots in it to control your mind, right? And again, yeah, I think, you know, like, yeah, quite often when you think you're an independent thinker, you're actually, like, you know, Russia or someone else is doing the thinking for you, and you're advancing political goals of some.
But do you think that it's actually different from that? So being an independent thinker, I have nothing against it, right? But they are not raising that culture of discord. They are making those groups enemies to each other, so they introduce conflict into it. That's the main goal. Because I don't have problem with flat earthers, because some of them are just trolling scientific community, some of them are just dumb, and some of them are, I don't know, they are seers of things as they are without conceptualizing the physics and whatever. So they just, I don't know, some Buddhists and monks and whatever. But once they start being aggressive towards other categories of people, that's when the things go bad.
Yeah, but yes, I think that's definitely one of the tools in the toolkit, right? To just like make sure, make people progress from, you know, shit posting on the internet to direct action, right?
And I think
do
something about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess there are only like two ways to fight this kind of problem, right? The easy and a hard one. The easy one would be, how do you fight propaganda with the opposite propaganda? And the other harder one is like we discussed before, of like educating, trying to get everyone on board, trying to kind of provide facts and whatnot. For Ukraine specifically, I think what helps a lot is when we show some kind of shed some light on how things happen, and then also our kind of Western partners prove that and verify and say like, yes, that's what we can see from our intelligence as well. And then, you know, everyone who doesn't believe it basically become this kind of just conspiracy theories, because like if US intelligence says this, Britain intelligence says this, Ukraine says it, and everyone else kind of seems to agree and you're against it, well, I mean, there is certainly some percent that you might be right, but
the British embassy of Russia
well,
says otherwise. Yeah. You know, everyone has their opinion. But what I would like to highlight is maybe the global resolution to this mass problem of radicalizing opinions and making people enemies to each other just because they believe different things is maybe not even educating, because educating is just indoctrinating people to what you believe is true.
Sure.
Even if it's true, it's not the best strategy. I think the best strategy would be to educate people about how to discuss and converse about all these things, right, without the conflict, without all this animosity and conflict, because in that way probably we could get better conversations and better client online, better climate online, and less complicated side effects of that on our politics.
Yeah, but I think it's incredibly difficult. You know, I used to, back in my younger days, I used to be really sort of infatuated with the so-called skeptics community on the internet, which is basically, you know, people who claim to apply the scientific method to every problem they see, sort of, you know, seek evidence and all that. But as with any community like that, I think, you know, they are in practice a lot more likely to accept without sufficient evidence, you know, the things that align with their worldview. And when they are faced with something that doesn't align with that worldview, they almost use their sort of, you know, their arguments as a shield to dismiss the sort of, you know, the like opposing views. And so it's and you know, many of the prominent skeptics, like, well, there's a couple of prominent names. I think actually embrace this like really set of really toxic online behaviors that you know, just really made me doubtful that, you know, just teaching people the scientific method is going to be the solution. Like as with any tool, you're going to use it as a weapon against, you know, the things you don't like.
People are subjective human beings, yes.
Yeah,
and also like Germans were pretty heavy on science as well. I mean, okay, Nazi Germany, right back in the day. So it's
science is just how you transform data into something useful and meaningful, right? So you have like algorithm and you have data. You have bad algorithm, no matter what data you have, you will have bad decisions. You have,
yeah, like, you know, like Nazi policies had like, you know, a lot of sort of
eugenics
backing from pathological science, right? Like, eugenics and like, you know, the like whatever the measurements of the size of your skull to decide that, you know, certain races are.
If you have political objective, you will distort any type of science. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, but speaking of skeptics, because we want to be mindful of your time and we're at our mark here, so I wanted to switch to a few web security questions that we prepared for the end, where your skeptic
big ones.
Where your skeptic hat will be definitely useful. So we were wondering what your thoughts about Web3 and kind of what is. I don't know, what is the future for Web3 and what do you think about all of this?
Nice. No, so I think, you know, platforms often succeed or fail not because of their technical merit, but because of the societal preferences, trends, or economic factors, right? That are difficult to meaningfully predict. I can't tell you what's going to be, fashionable to wear 10 years from now. So it's difficult for me to tell you if, Web3 is going to be successful for basically the same reasons. So I'm not going to say that Web 3.0 is doomed, but on a technical level, I think that the benefits seem quite unconvincing to me. There's obviously a lot of shady things happening in that space, which is expected with any emerging technology, doubly so if money is involved. And it is a rather poorly defined concept. But one of the key selling points is that it's a way to move away from the centralized internet that we have today, which seems noble, except nothing about the old internet really required centralization. And in fact, back in the early days, you had this strong culture of self-hosting content and services, and everybody was running their own email server and whatever. But down the line, I think most people just didn't need or want any of that. They didn't want to configure their own mail software and spam filtering, and they did not want to keep updating it forever. So
consumerism takes over.
And they look to providers like Gmail was successful just because it was convenient, right? Not because the internet is designed in a way that requires Gmail to be the sort of central email clearinghouse for the entire world. And so you can see the same in the world of cryptocurrencies and Web 3.0, where you end up with centralized platforms that are suspiciously similar to old-fashioned banks or image hosting services or whatever. Because again, people don't want to tinker with cryptography on their computers. They just want, a point-and-click interface that they can access from anywhere, ideally both from their phone and from whatever computer they come across. So maybe the future of Web 3.0 is bright, but I kind of doubt that any of the supposed technical benefits are really going to be the selling point. Yeah.
That makes sense. Sense. I can speak by after an hour. Vlad, do you have anything to add?
Alex wanted to ask something, but we brutally
I did have a question about the previous topic for Web3. I think, right? We remember that you're skeptical, right? So that's why we can take this into account. For actually, one thing I think we missed about this discussion about fighting propaganda is actually technology aspect, which is kind of orthogonal. So do you think we can build these tools that will help us actually to fight these conspiracy theories, polarization of opinions and so on? Because there is lots of academic research going on, how to identify fake news, disinformation, right? So do you think this is will it help actually significantly, or, it's still a very hard task?
I'm unconvinced because I think, there is one point where technology can offer a clear benefit, and that is sort of, attribution, right? Understanding where a particular piece of news came from, although that may not be sufficient because, again, quite often the operations are about amplifying existing news or headlines in a particular way, that is sort of not authentic, right? That would not be happening otherwise. Or, attributing influence, right? Like how was this promoted, how did it raise to the top of your news feed or whatever, or how did it end up in the headlines in traditional press. But beyond that, I think you're dealing largely with a non-technical problem, right? And again, if you have a journalist or a politician who honestly and wholeheartedly believes in the talking points they picked up from Russian or Chinese or North Korean or Saudi Arabian or British intelligence operation, there's no way to fix that with an algorithm, and I think a lot of it does boil down to that. But blockchain is not necessary to solve that, right? And I think that it can solve a lot of problems, but very, very few problems need a blockchain to be solved, right? And so that's, I think, my most significant reservation. That doesn't mean that people often use suboptimal or unnecessary solutions because you have to solve it in a particular way, and you may as well have a preference for that. And if everybody else sort of picks up by default what you did, that becomes the status quo. So I'm not saying like there's not going to be blockchain in our lives, and it's not going to be a part of a solution to fake news or misinformation. But like again, instinctively, I just don't see this obvious place where this fits and nothing else does, right?
So blockchain is not going to help us being prepared for the doomsday. How come?
Well,
Anyway, yeah, it all makes sense. It's about being practical and thinking, I don't know, the easiest solution that can get us there. And it seems like blockchain is not the easiest or most reliable solution.
Again, it's often not the easiest solution that wins, right? Like there's plenty of like, even if you look at our tech stacks, there's a lot of things that are just like twice as complicated as there should be. But again, like I don't think it has like an inherent advantage as a solution, right? That's my objection.
Yeah, if you're talking about Web3, actually, my main concern is like this term, because I don't think that blockchain even like is close to call it Web3, right? So Web3 should be a bit different, right? Like, and if we're talking about distributed web applications, also I don't see it there yet, right? So.
Well, because you want to make it sound like next generation.
Maybe I just got an idea. So maybe we don't have tools to fix false information, but we have such a great social construct called reputation that basically fixes this thing in small communities. So if a person is constantly lying, they will get bad reputation, and it will go before them, and when they even change their habitat, they will be perceived based on the reputation that came with them or from someone that other person
Is it true
knew.
for Russian Ministry of Affairs?
No,
if you
just
constantly lie, I think you will get promoted there.
No,
doesn't scale much. Doesn't scale much. Do we have tools for scaling reputation?
I'm not sure, and I think that's actually if you want to call out one of the evils of the internet, I think it's probably that it actually sort of breaks down those small communities where you could maintain stable reputation, and it's a world where you get, again, like you have like filter bubbles, and you can reach, if you want to promote an extremist ideology, you can reach out extremists all over the world, right? And rally them up behind some really toxic, terrible ideas. And it's not just in the context of government operations, like if you look at some of the incel stuff or which led to mass shootings in the US in the past, right? And stuff like that. I think that's actually kind of like, it's beautiful when it's like most of the time it's beautiful, right? That you can access, you have access to all the global knowledge at your fingertips, and you can connect with people with similar interests around the globe. Except if your interests are toxic, that's kind of sucks, right? That you can always connect with a like-minded Nazi who wants to orchestrate a mass shooting, right?
I was gonna say, I think the engineer.
There's a work to do.
Engineers in us,
yeah.
I think the engineers in us want to find like this beautiful universal solution, right, that will solve all our problems. But in reality, like we'll still always, as long as we are humans, will boil down to some tribes following our certain leaders, and some of them will be based on good, positive, true values. Some of them will be based on lies. Sometimes you won't be able to tell the difference between the two, and that's how we're gonna have to live until I don't know, AI takes over. So on this skeptic note, I wanna, unless you wanna add something to our audience, typically in the end we ask if you wanna tell something to Ukrainians, any advice, personal safety advice, or anything you just wanna say, feel free.
It's difficult to say something that is not gonna sound trite, and I think, like we talked about personal safety advice, I can't claim to understand what people are going through. I obviously came from a country next door that went through many of the same adventures over the past several decades. and I have, I have family in Poland. I have friends in Ukraine. So I'm really hoping for the best. I think, the reality of war is that conflict is often bloody and protracted, and there are no sort of, quick solutions in sight. But I obviously am rooting for Ukraine, and I hope that the country prevails.
We want to thank you so much. And also, I've just been to Poland last week, like I mentioned before, and I think I'll be speaking not just for us, but like for every Ukrainian when I say that we're truly, truly thankful for Polish people and how they help us. Because again, if we look into history, it's not that our nations never had any, any issues, but we're just very happy that at least these two nations chose to live with the future, not with the past. And the level of the number of Ukrainians in Poland right now and the level of support they get from Polish people is just like staggering. I think in Krakow is like every fourth is Ukrainian right now. And so, yeah, we just want to thank for that. Because this is what matters. Like this is the situation where you learn who your friends are. And we'll definitely be hoping for the best. Meanwhile, I also want to remind that we're doing it to support Ukraine. So you'll be able to see the links in the description for funds where you can donate. It doesn't have to be big. It's best when it's a small but regular donation. So there is a kind of predictable pipeline of support. Just let's hope for the closest victory possible. And so Europe is at peace again. And we want to also thank Michal for finding the time to talk to us. It was very interesting and very insightful, very fun at times, which we definitely appreciate as well. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again for having me.
Yeah,
and for the thoughtful questions. I really like the conversation.